Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we're diving into something that might just be the most bewildering collection of deities ever imagined by human minds. Egypt's gods were not content to be simple, dignified figures sitting on thrones with pleasant smiles. No, they were strange. They were unsettling. They were magnificent in ways that make you wonder what exactly was happening in the minds of the people who created them. We're talking about gods with the heads of hippos who devoured the hearts of the unworthy. Gods who existed as living mummified bulls. Gods whose very existence was tied to the act of vomiting up the universe. Gods who were simultaneously male and female, or who changed gender depending on the phase of the moon, or who didn't have gender at all because they were busy being a primordial concept made flesh. Tonight we'll meet deities who would make modern horror writers weep with envy. We'll explore gods whose worship required rituals so bizarre that archaeologists still argue about whether the ancient texts are being literal or metaphorical. And we'll uncover the stories behind gods whose names alone could fill a fever dream. As always, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you. Whether you're settling into bed or simply need something to occupy your mind while the world grows quiet around you, I'm glad you're here. Now let's begin our journey into the stranger corners of the Egyptian pantheon. The thing about Egyptian mythology is that it never met a concept it couldn't turn into a god. Other cultures might have a god of war, a god of love, maybe a god of the harvest. The Egyptians had a god for the specific moment when bread dough begins to rise. They had a god for the particular type of headache you get when you've been staring at papyrus scrolls for too long. They had a god whose entire job was to make sure that other gods remembered to do their jobs properly. But even among this vast collection of highly specialized deities, some stand out as particularly unusual. These are the gods that make you pause and wonder not just how they came to exist, but how anyone ever thought worshiping them was a good idea. Let's start with Ammit, whose name translates roughly to devourer of the dead. Now that's already a promising beginning for a deity, isn't it? Ammit had the head of a crocodile, the torso of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus. She was essentially a divine chimera built from the three animals that ancient Egyptians feared most. This wasn't some abstract theological concept. This was a god designed to embody pure, concentrated terror. Ammit lived in the Hall of Two Truths, where the hearts of the dead were weighed against the feather of Ma'at to determine their worthiness for the afterlife. If your heart was heavy with sin, if it tipped the scales in the wrong direction, Ammit would leap forward and devour both your heart and your soul. This wasn't just death. This was complete obliteration. Your existence would be erased so thoroughly that even the gods would forget you had ever lived. The Egyptians were so serious about Ammit that they created elaborate spells and amulets designed specifically to avoid her attention. They would write her name in red ink on tomb walls, the color of blood and danger, as a warning to any soul that might be tempted to lie during their judgment. They carved her image into scarabs that the dead would carry with them, not for protection, but as a constant reminder of what waited for those who had lived dishonestly, What makes Ammit particularly unsettling is that she wasn't evil in the traditional sense. She was necessary. She was justice made manifest in the most terrifying form possible. The Egyptians understood that for their moral system to work, there had to be consequences that were so absolute, so final, that even contemplating them would keep people honest during their earthly lives. But Ammit was hardly the only god whose appearance would have sent lesser mortals screaming into the desert. Consider Sobek, the crocodile god who was worshipped with actual living crocodiles. The priests of Sobek would keep sacred crocodiles in temple pools, adorning them with gold jewelry and precious stones. They would feed these creatures the finest meats and treat them as living manifestations of their god. When one of these sacred crocodiles died, it would be mummified with the same care given to pharaohs. The process could take months. The crocodile's body would be wrapped in linen bandages, its cavities filled with natron salt and aromatic oils. Precious amulets would be placed within the wrappings. The finished mummy would then be placed in its own sarcophagus and buried in sacred ground. But here's where it gets truly strange. The Egyptians believed that Sobek could be both benevolent and malevolent simultaneously. He was the protector of the pharaoh and the patron of the army. But he was also the god who could drag you beneath the waters of the Nile if you offended him. Prayers to Sobek were often contradictory, asking for his protection while simultaneously begging him not to notice the petitioner. The crocodile mummies themselves became objects of pilgrimage. People would travel from across Egypt to visit the tombs of these sacred animals, leaving offerings and seeking blessings. Some of these crocodile cemeteries contained thousands of mummified crocodiles of all sizes, from massive adults to tiny hatchlings. The sheer scale of this practice suggests a level of devotion that bordered on obsession. Then there's Khnum, the ram-headed god who was said to have created humanity on a potter's wheel. This might sound relatively normal until you learn that Khnum was believed to literally sculpt each person's ka, or life force, before their birth. Every personality trait, every physical characteristic, every quirk and flaw was supposedly shaped by Khnum's hands as he worked at his cosmic pottery wheel. The implications of this belief were staggering. If someone was born with a disability, it was because Khnum had deliberately crafted them that way for reasons beyond human understanding. If someone was particularly beautiful or talented, it was because Khnum had taken special care with their creation. This wasn't just theology. It was a complete explanation for human diversity wrapped up in the image of a ram-headed god hunched over a potter's wheel somewhere in the cosmic void. Khnum's workshops were said to be located in caves beneath the first cataract of the Nile, where the sound of his potter's wheel could sometimes be heard echoing through the water. Priests would lower offerings into these caves, hoping to influence Khnum's work on behalf of expectant mothers. The offerings were specific and strange: clay figurines of idealized human forms, precious stones arranged in patterns that mimicked the spiral of a potter's wheel, and written petitions describing the desired characteristics of unborn children. But perhaps no Egyptian god captures the sheer weirdness of the pantheon quite like Atum, the self-created god who brought the universe into existence through an act that ancient texts describe with remarkable frankness. Atum, according to the Heliopolitan creation myth, created the first gods by masturbating them into existence. The texts are quite explicit about this, describing how Atum took his phallus in his grasp and through his climax brought forth Shu, the god of air, and Tefnut, the goddess of moisture. This wasn't considered crude or inappropriate by the ancient Egyptians. It was cosmic truth. The universe began with an act of divine self-pleasure, and from that act came all of creation. Shu and Tefnut would go on to create Geb, the earth god, and Nut, the sky goddess, who would in turn create Osiris, Isis, Seth, and Nephthys. All of existence could be traced back to that primal moment of divine release. The rituals associated with Atum were correspondingly unusual. Priests would reenact the creation myth through ceremonies that were considered so sacred that they were performed in complete secrecy. Only the highest-ranking priests were allowed to participate, and the exact details of these rituals were never written down. What we know comes from fragmentary references and the occasional slip of the tongue in other texts. What makes this even more fascinating is that the Egyptians saw nothing contradictory about worshipping Atum alongside more conventional deities. He was simultaneously the primordial creator god and a deity whose defining characteristic was divine masturbation. This kind of theological flexibility was typical of Egyptian religion, where gods could embody seemingly contradictory aspects without anyone feeling the need to resolve the apparent paradoxes. The ancient Egyptians had a god for everything, and I mean everything. They had Meretzker, the cobra goddess who lived in the mountains near the Valley of the Kings and was known for striking down tomb robbers with blindness or death. They had Heket, the frog-headed goddess of childbirth who was invoked during difficult labors and was said to breathe life into newborn children. They had Renenutet, the cobra goddess of the harvest, who was believed to live in granaries and would either protect the stored grain or allow it to spoil depending on how well she was treated. But the god that perhaps best exemplifies the Egyptian talent for taking a simple concept and making it profoundly unsettling is Khenti-Amentu, whose name means foremost of the Westerners. The West was where the sun died each day, where the dead were buried, where all things went to end. Khenti-Amentu was the god of that ending, but not in any comforting sense. He wasn't a gentle guide to the afterlife. He was the embodiment of the absolute finality of death. Khenti-Amentu was depicted as a mummified figure, but unlike other mummified gods, he was shown in the process of decay. His wrappings were torn and stained. His exposed flesh was green with decomposition. His eyes were empty sockets that seemed to stare directly into the souls of those who looked upon his image. This wasn't death as peaceful sleep. This was death as corruption, as the inevitable dissolution of everything that had once been alive. The cult of Khenti-Amentu was particularly popular among embalmers who saw him as their patron deity. They would invoke his name while preparing bodies for mummification, asking him to slow the process of decay long enough for the proper rituals to be completed. But they also feared him because they knew that no matter how skilled they were, no matter how perfectly they preserved a body, eventually Khenti-Amentu would claim it. Their art was not about defeating death, but about negotiating with it, buying time for the deceased to make their journey to the afterlife before the inevitable corruption set in. The rituals associated with Kenti Amentu were performed in the depths of night, in chambers far below ground where the living rarely ventured. Priests would descend into these spaces carrying oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on walls covered with images of the decomposing god. They would chant prayers that acknowledged the power of decay while asking for its postponement. They would make offerings of things that were already in the process of rotting. Overripe fruit, meat that had been left in the sun, flowers that had begun to wilt. These ceremonies weren't morbid in the way we might think of them today. They were practical acknowledgments of reality. The Egyptians understood that death and decay were natural processes, and they believed that by honoring the god who presided over these processes, they could better understand and work with them rather than simply being victims of them. As we delve deeper into these strange deities, what becomes clear is that the ancient Egyptians had a relationship with the divine that was far more complex and nuanced than simple worship. Their gods weren't perfect beings to be adored from a distance. They were forces of nature, embodiments of human experience, and reflections of the cosmos itself, complete with all its beauty, terror, and inexplicable weirdness. The ancient Egyptians didn't just stop at gods who embodied death and decay. They went further, creating deities that challenged every conventional notion of what a god should be or do. Take Ai, the child god of music, who was depicted as an infant holding a sistrum, a kind of sacred rattle. This might sound charming until you learn that Ai was believed to have been born fully aware of every sound that had ever existed or ever would exist. His crying as a baby wasn't the normal wailing of an infant, but rather a cosmic symphony that could drive mortals insane if they heard it directly. The priests of Ai developed an entire musical tradition based on attempting to approximate the god's infant cries without actually reproducing them. They created instruments that could only be played by musicians who had undergone specific training designed to protect their sanity. These musicians would practice in soundproof chambers deep within temples, slowly building up their tolerance to increasingly complex musical patterns that supposedly echoed fragments of Ai's divine babbling. What made this particularly unsettling was that Ai was said to age backwards. He had been born ancient and wise, and as time passed, he became younger and more innocent, forgetting the cosmic secrets he had known as a newborn. This meant that his music, too, became simpler and more beautiful as centuries passed, but also less powerful. The earliest compositions attributed to Ai were said to be so complex and alien that they could reshape reality itself. Later pieces were merely capable of healing the sick or summoning rain. Then there's Heka, the god of magic, who existed before existence itself. Heka wasn't just a practitioner of magic, he was magic. Every spell ever cast, every charm ever written, every protective amulet ever crafted drew its power from Heka's very being. But here's where it gets strange. Heka was said to be simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, present in every magical act but never actually visible or directly contactable. The worship of Heka involved rituals that were designed to acknowledge his presence without summoning him directly. Priests would perform ceremonies in which they would speak to empty air, making offerings to spaces that appeared vacant but which they insisted were occupied by the god. They would set places at banquet tables for Heka, serve him food that would remain untouched, and conduct conversations with silence. These weren't symbolic gestures. The priests genuinely believed that Heka was there, participating in their rituals, responding to their prayers. They would interpret the slightest movement of air, the flickering of candle flames, even the settling of dust as signs of the god's approval or disapproval. Entire temple hierarchies were built around people whose job was to observe these minute phenomena and translate them into divine will. The magic associated with Heka wasn't the flashy sorcery of popular imagination. It was subtle, pervasive, and deeply unsettling. Practitioners claimed they could use Heka's power to make small changes in reality that would compound over time. They might adjust the exact moment when a seed sprouted, knowing that this tiny alteration would eventually result in a completely different harvest. They might change the precise angle at which sunlight struck a building, trusting that this would influence the thoughts of everyone who entered that space for generations to come. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Egyptian religion was their concept of gods who existed in states of perpetual transformation. Consider Khepri, the scarab beetle god who was believed to push the sun across the sky each day. Khepri wasn't just associated with beetles, he was a beetle, specifically a dung beetle, rolling the sun like a ball of cosmic excrement from horizon to horizon. This image was both profound and deeply unsettling to the Egyptian mind. The sun, source of all life, was being moved across the sky by a creature that lived in filth. But this wasn't seen as degrading to the sun. Instead, it was a recognition that life emerges from death, that beauty comes from decay, that the most sacred processes often involve the most humble materials. Khepri's transformations were said to be constant and visible. Observers claimed they could sometimes see the god's true form in the behavior of actual dung beetles, particularly in the way they would suddenly stop their work and point their heads toward the sky, as if receiving instructions from their divine counterpart. Entire schools of divination developed around interpreting the movements of beetles, with specialist priests who could supposedly read the future in the patterns of insect behavior. The temples of Khepri were unlike any others in Egypt. Instead of grand halls filled with statues and altars, they were vast gardens filled with carefully maintained dung heaps. Priests would tend these heaps like sacred gardens, ensuring they maintained the perfect consistency and aroma to attract the maximum number of beetles. The sight of thousands of scarabs crawling over these mounds was considered one of the most beautiful spectacles in religious Egypt. Visitors to these temples would often experience what priests called the awakening, a sudden understanding that the crawling mass of insects was actually a single organism, a manifestation of the god himself. People reported feeling as though the boundaries between individual beetles dissolved, revealing Khepri's true nature as a unified consciousness expressing itself through countless tiny bodies. Then there's Nekhbet, the vulture goddess of Upper Egypt, whose worship involved some of the most macabre practices in the ancient world. Nekhbet was said to feed exclusively on the eyes of the dead, not out of cruelty, but because she believed that the last thing a person saw before dying contained the essence of their soul. By consuming these eyes, she was preserving the memories and experiences of the deceased. The priests of Nekhbet practiced a form of mortuary ritual that involved carefully removing the eyes from corpses before mummification. These eyes would be prepared with special spices and oils, then placed in small jars that were left on high platforms where vultures could access them. The birds that came to feed were believed to be messengers of Nekhbet, carrying the preserved memories back to the goddess. But the truly unsettling part was that Nekhbet was said to occasionally return these memories to the living. People would report sudden, vivid recollections of experiences they had never had, places they had never been, people they had never met. These were understood to be glimpses of the memories that Nekhbet had collected from the dead and was now sharing with the living as a form of divine revelation. Some individuals became addicted to these borrowed memories, spending their entire lives trying to attract Nekhbet's attention in hopes of experiencing more of these otherworldly recollections. They would sleep on rooftops where vultures nested, eat foods that vultures favored, even go so far as to mimic the behavior of carrion birds in hopes of catching the goddess's notice. The practice became so widespread that temples had to establish rules about memory sharing. Priests would interview people claiming to have received Nekhbet's visions, attempting to distinguish between genuine divine experiences and simple hallucinations or lies. They developed elaborate tests involving knowledge that only the dead could possess, creating a bizarre form of supernatural authentication. And then there was Wepwawit, the wolf god whose name means opener of the ways. Wepwawit's role was to scout ahead for other gods, exploring dangerous territories and clearing paths through the underworld. But what made him particularly strange was that he was said to exist simultaneously in multiple locations, sending aspects of himself to investigate different routes at the same time. This multiplicity wasn't just spiritual metaphor. Worshippers claimed they could encounter different versions of Wepwawit in different places, and these versions might have contradictory information or conflicting personalities. One aspect might be helpful and wise, while another might be cruel and deceptive. The challenge for mortals was learning to distinguish between these different facets of the god and understanding which one they were dealing with at any given moment. The priests of Wepwawit developed elaborate protocols for identifying which aspect of the god they were encountering. They would ask specific questions whose answers would reveal the particular version's nature and intentions. They created maps showing the territories associated with each aspect, and they established safe houses where travelers could take refuge if they encountered a hostile version of their patron deity. What emerges from all these strange deities is a picture of a religious system that was far more complex and psychologically sophisticated than we might expect from the ancient world. The Egyptians weren't just worshipping idealized figures. They were grappling with the full spectrum of existence, including its most disturbing and incomprehensible aspects. Their gods embodied not just human hopes and fears, but the weird, inexplicable nature of reality itself. These weren't gods designed to comfort their worshippers with simple answers. They were gods that reflected the genuine strangeness of being alive, of being conscious, of existing in a universe that often seems to operate according to rules that make no sense whatsoever. In creating these bizarre deities, the ancient Egyptians were acknowledging something profound about the nature of existence, that it's far stranger than we usually allow ourselves to admit. The Egyptians didn't stop with gods who merely existed in multiple places at once. They pushed the boundaries of divine weirdness even further with deities who existed in multiple times simultaneously. Consider Seshat, the goddess of writing and measurement, who was said to experience all moments of history as a single eternal present. When scribes invoked Seshat while working on important documents, they believed she could see not only what they were writing, but also every future interpretation of those words, every translation, every misunderstanding that would arise across millennia. Saido, this temporal omnipresence made Seshat's worship particularly anxious. Her priests understood that every word they wrote, every measurement they recorded was being evaluated not just by their contemporaries, but by the goddess who knew exactly how those records would be used thousands of years in the future. They developed a form of writing called eternal script, which involved embedding multiple layers of meaning into texts so that they would remain accurate regardless of how language evolved or how society changed. The scribes of Seshat would spend months crafting single sentences, considering not just their immediate meaning but their potential interpretations by future readers who might have completely different cultural contexts. They created documents that were essentially time-proof, designed to communicate across the centuries with anyone who might discover them. The mental strain of this kind of writing was enormous. Many scribes reported dreams in which they saw their own words being read by strange people in impossible futures, often driving them to madness. But even Seshat's temporal complexity pales beside the sheer conceptual impossibility of Ptah, the creator god of Memphis, who was believed to have brought everything into existence not through action, but through speech that occurred before language existed. Ptah spoke the universe into being using words that had no meaning until the moment he uttered them, creating not just things, but the very concepts those things represented. This wasn't poetic metaphor to the ancient Egyptians. They believed that Ptah's original words still echoed throughout creation, that every sound ever made was somehow a reflection of that primordial divine speech. His priests developed incredibly sophisticated acoustic theories, mapping the supposed relationships between different sounds and their corresponding aspects of reality. They believed they could alter the physical world by reproducing fragments of Ptah's original creative utterances. The temples of Ptah were designed as massive sound chambers with walls shaped to amplify and focus acoustic vibrations in precise ways. Priests would spend years learning to produce specific tones that supposedly echoed Ptah's creative words. These vocalizations were said to be so powerful that they could only be performed in specially constructed rooms with walls thick enough to contain their effects. Mistakes in pronunciation could theoretically unmake portions of reality. The most dedicated priests of Ptah would undergo surgical procedures to modify their vocal cords, allowing them to produce sounds that were impossible for normal human throats. They would have their tongues pierced with gold wires that vibrated at specific frequencies, or have small chambers implanted in their throats to create resonance effects. These modifications were considered sacred, transforming the priests into living instruments capable of channeling the gods' creative power. What made this even more unsettling was the belief that Ta was still speaking, continuously creating new aspects of reality through ongoing divine utterances that were too subtle for mortal ears to detect. His priests claimed they could sometimes hear these whispered words in the spaces between other sounds, in the silence that follows thunder, in the pause between heartbeats. They developed meditation techniques designed to quiet the mind enough to perceive these cosmic whispers. Then there's Neith, the goddess of weaving and war, whose worship involved one of the most disturbing practices in Egyptian religion. Neith was believed to weave the fates of mortals on a cosmic loom, creating the threads that would determine the course of individual lives. But here's the horrifying part. She was said to weave these fates using material unraveled from the lives of people who had already died. Every thread on Neith's loom represented experiences, memories, emotions, and choices that had belonged to the deceased. When someone died, their entire existence would be unraveled and spun into raw material for future lives. The patterns Neith wove determined not just what would happen to people, but who they would be, what they would feel, how they would think. Your personality, according to this belief, was literally constructed from the recycled remnants of dead strangers. The implications were staggering. Every emotion you felt might have originally belonged to someone who died centuries ago. Every decision you made might be the echo of a choice made by a person whose name had been forgotten by history. Your loves, your fears, your dreams, your nightmares, all of it potentially borrowed from the unraveled threads of the dead. Neith's priests developed rituals designed to honor the unknown dead whose essence might be woven into the lives of the living. They would hold ceremonies for the unnamed contributors, acknowledging the countless deceased whose experiences had been recycled into contemporary existence. These rituals involved burning offerings while reciting lists of human experiences. First love, the taste of bread, the sound of rain, the fear of death, thanking whoever had originally felt these things for providing the raw material of current life. Some devotees of Neith became obsessed with trying to identify the original owners of their borrowed experiences. They would spend years analyzing their own emotions and memories, looking for patterns that might reveal whose recycled essence they carried. They developed elaborate genealogies of feeling, attempting to trace their psychological inheritance back through the cycles of death and rebirth that fed Neith's loom. Khnum, the goddess, was also associated with a particularly disturbing form of divination called thread reading, in which priests would examine actual textiles to predict the future. They believed that the patterns in woven cloth reflected the larger patterns on Neith's cosmic loom, and that skilled interpreters could read these smaller tapestries to understand what the goddess was weaving for individuals or communities. Thread readers would examine everything from the robes of petitioners to the sails of ships, looking for irregularities in the weave that might indicate disruptions in fate. They would study the way threads caught light, how they felt to the touch, even how they smelled, believing that every aspect of a textile carried information about the cosmic patterns it reflected. The most skilled thread readers claimed they could predict not just future events, but the emotional states that would accompany those events, the exact thoughts people would have, even the dreams they would experience. But perhaps no Egyptian deity embodies the religion's capacity for pure conceptual horror quite like Apep, the serpent of chaos who existed in a state of eternal dying. Unlike other gods who might die and be reborn, Apep was trapped in the perpetual process of destruction without ever actually achieving the release of death. Every night he would battle Ra, the sun god, and every night he would be defeated and wounded, only to regenerate enough to fight again the following evening. This eternal dying wasn't punishment for some cosmic crime. It was Apep's essential nature. He was chaos incarnate, and chaos cannot truly be destroyed because the absence of chaos would itself be a form of order, which chaos opposes by its very definition. So Apep existed in a state of constant agony, forever being destroyed, forever regenerating, forever suffering without hope of relief. The Egyptians understood that Apep's eternal torment was necessary for the continuation of existence. His nightly battles with Ra weren't just mythological stories. They were the cosmic engine that drove the sun across the sky and maintained the cycle of day and night. Without Apep's opposition, Ra would have no need to move, and the sun would simply stay in one place until the world burned or froze. This created a theological paradox that the Egyptians embraced rather than resolved. They simultaneously worked to defeat Apep and to ensure his continued existence. Priests would perform rituals designed to weaken the serpent enough that Ra could win each night's battle, but not so much that Apep would be permanently destroyed. They had to calibrate their magic precisely, providing just enough support to maintain the cosmic balance without tipping it too far in either direction. The rituals themselves were elaborate performances of controlled hatred. Priests would create wax models of Apep, then torture these effigies in carefully prescribed ways, stabbing them with knives, burning them with hot coals, trampling them underfoot. But they had to perform these acts with perfect emotional detachment, hating Apep without allowing that hatred to consume them, because uncontrolled emotion might disrupt the delicate balance they were trying to maintain. Some priests spent their entire careers learning to hate with mathematical precision, developing techniques for generating exactly the right amount of malice needed for their rituals. They would practice on smaller wax figures, measuring their emotional responses, calibrating their feelings like craftsmen adjusting tools. Too little hatred and the ritual would be ineffective. Too much and they risked unleashing chaos into their own lives. The most dedicated servants of this cosmic balance would undergo procedures to enhance their capacity for controlled emotion. They would have their hearts pierced with tiny needles made from meteoric iron, believing this would allow them to feel hatred and compassion simultaneously without being overwhelmed by either. They would train their minds to hold contradictory emotions in perfect equilibrium, becoming living embodiments of the balance between order and chaos. And then there were the gods whose very existence challenged the fundamental categories of being itself. Take Hauhet, the goddess of infinity, who was both everywhere and nowhere, both everything and nothing. Hauhet represented the concept of boundlessness made manifest, which created immediate logical problems for anyone trying to worship her. How do you build a temple to infinity? How do you make offerings to something that already contains everything? How do you pray to a goddess who is simultaneously listening and not listening, present and absent, caring and indifferent? The priests of Hauhet developed what they called paradox worship, rituals that deliberately embraced logical contradiction as a form of devotion. They would build temples with no walls, reasoning that any boundary would limit Hauhet's infinite nature. They would make offerings of empty space, setting aside areas of nothingness and dedicating them to the goddess. They would pray in silence, believing that words would constrain Hauhet's limitless being. And they would also pray continuously, believing that any pause would exclude part of her infinite presence. The most devoted followers of Hauhet would attempt to experience infinity directly through meditation techniques designed to dissolve the boundaries of individual consciousness. They would spend days or weeks in trance states, trying to expand their awareness until it encompassed everything and nothing simultaneously. Many never returned from these journeys, their minds apparently absorbed into the infinite consciousness they sought to contact. Those who did return often spoke in paradoxes, claiming to have learned truths that could only be expressed through contradiction. They would say things like, Hauhet is the absence that contains all presence, or she is the question that answers itself by never being asked. These statements weren't meant to be understood intellectually. They were supposed to trigger a kind of cognitive breakdown that would allow the listener to glimpse infinity directly. The worship of Hauhet created entire schools of philosophy dedicated to exploring the implications of infinity in daily life. Scholars would spend decades contemplating questions like whether it was possible to make a finite number of infinite prayers, or whether Hauhet's infinite nature meant she was simultaneously every other god and none of them. These weren't academic exercises. They were desperate attempts to understand how finite beings could relate to an infinite deity without being destroyed by the contact. As we continue our journey through these impossible gods, what becomes increasingly clear is that the ancient Egyptians weren't content with simple answers to complex questions. They preferred complex answers to simple questions, creating a religious system that reflected the genuine weirdness of existence rather than trying to explain it away. Their gods weren't comforting figures designed to make sense of a senseless world. They were accurate representations of just how strange that world really was. The deeper we go into this pantheon, the more it becomes apparent that these weren't just religious beliefs, but sophisticated attempts to grapple with fundamental questions about consciousness, reality, and the nature of being itself. The Egyptians created gods that embodied paradox, embraced contradiction, and reveled in impossibility because they understood something that we often forget. The universe is far stranger than our minds can easily accommodate, and any honest attempt to understand it must be prepared to venture into territories where logic breaks down and sanity becomes optional. What's perhaps most unsettling about Egyptian theology is how it treated the concept of divine madness not as a flaw but as a necessary feature of godhood. Consider Sekhmet, the lioness goddess of war and healing, who was said to exist in a state of perpetual bloodlust that could only be temporarily sated, never cured. Sekhmet wasn't simply violent. She was violence incarnate, a deity whose very existence depended on her ability to destroy. The myth tells us that Ra once sent Sekhmet to punish humanity for their disobedience. But she became so intoxicated by the taste of blood that she couldn't stop killing. Ra had to trick her into drinking beer dyed red with ochre, making her believe it was blood until she became drunk enough to fall asleep. When she awoke, her bloodlust had been temporarily satisfied, but the underlying hunger remained, waiting to surface again. What makes this particularly disturbing is that the Egyptians understood Sekhmet's madness to be both terrifying and essential. She was the patron goddess of physicians precisely because her intimate knowledge of how to destroy the human body made her uniquely qualified to heal it. Her temples served simultaneously as hospitals and armories, places where the sick came to be cured and warriors came to be blessed before battle. The priests of Sekhmet had to maintain a delicate balance, channeling the goddess's destructive power for healing purposes while preventing it from spiraling into uncontrolled violence. They would perform daily rituals designed to feed Sekhmet's bloodlust in controlled ways, offering her animal sacrifices while visualizing the diseases and injuries they wanted her to destroy. Too little sacrifice, and she might turn her hunger on the patients they were trying to heal. Too much, and she might become so excited by the blood that she would begin hunting human prey. The most experienced healers would actually invoke Sekhmet's madness into themselves, allowing the goddess's destructive instincts to guide their surgical procedures. They would enter trance states where they claimed to see through the lioness's eyes, perceiving the human body as both prey to be hunted and patient to be healed. In these altered states, they would perform operations with a precision and ruthlessness that conscious thought could never achieve. But even Sekhmet's controlled madness seems almost rational compared to the worship of Bez, the dwarf god whose domain included childbirth, household protection, and cosmic horror in equal measure. Bes was depicted as a grotesque figure with a lion's mane, a protruding tongue, and an expression of maniacal glee that suggested he found something hilariously funny about the entire universe. Unlike other Egyptian gods who were typically shown in profile to emphasize their otherworldly dignity, Bez was always depicted facing forward, staring directly at the viewer with bulging eyes and that disturbing grin. This wasn't meant to be comforting. Bes protected households by being so unsettling that evil spirits would flee rather than risk encountering him. He was essentially a divine scarecrow, using his own monstrosity to frighten away greater monsters. The worship of Bez involved rituals that were designed to be as disturbing as possible. Priests would dress in costumes that exaggerated the god's grotesque features, wearing masks with protruding eyes and tongues that hung down to their chests. They would perform dances that mimicked the movements of someone having a seizure, accompanied by music played on instruments that were deliberately tuned to create the most unpleasant sounds possible. These ceremonies weren't performed in temples, but in private homes, usually during childbirth or when a family was experiencing a run of bad luck. The idea was to make so much disturbing noise and create such a spectacle of controlled chaos that any malevolent spirits in the area would decide to find somewhere quieter to cause trouble. The priests would continue their grotesque performances until they had thoroughly polluted the spiritual atmosphere of the house with their own brand of benevolent madness. So, Solomon, what's particularly unsettling about Bez is that his protection was conditional on his continued amusement. If he stopped finding the situation funny, his protection would evaporate immediately. Families had to constantly perform small acts of absurdity to maintain his interest, leaving out offerings of toys and jokes, arranging household objects in ridiculous configurations, even teaching their children to walk and talk in ways that would entertain the watching god. Some households became so focused on amusing Bez that they descended into a kind of domestic surrealism, where every aspect of daily life was performed with an eye toward divine entertainment. Children would be taught to cry in musical scales. Meals would be served in deliberately confusing arrangements. Conversations would be conducted in nonsensical riddles that only made sense if you understood them as performances for an audience of one invisible, grinning dwarf god. Then there's Taweret, the hippopotamus goddess of childbirth, who embodied one of the most psychologically complex concepts in Egyptian theology. Taweret was simultaneously nurturing and terrifying, protective and dangerous, maternal and predatory. She had the head and body of a pregnant hippopotamus, the arms of a lion and the tail of a crocodile, making her a chimera of the Nile's most dangerous creatures, transformed into a symbol of feminine power. The psychological implications of worshipping Taweret were profound. She represented the understanding that birth and death were intimately connected, that bringing new life into the world required confronting the possibility of destruction. Women in labor would invoke Taweret not just for protection, but for the strength to embrace the violent aspects of the birthing process, to become temporarily as fierce and dangerous as the goddess herself. Tawaret's rituals involved a form of controlled possession where laboring women would channel the goddess's aggressive energy. Midwives would encourage them to growl, to bare their teeth, to imagine themselves as massive, unstoppable creatures capable of crushing any threat to their unborn children. The birthing chamber would be decorated with images of Taweret in her most fearsome aspect, reminding everyone present that they were witnessing not just the arrival of new life, but the manifestation of primal feminine power. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Tawaret's worship was the belief that she fed on the fear of expectant fathers. The goddess was said to grow stronger when men experienced terror at the prospect of their children's birth, not out of cruelty, but because that fear represented the father's recognition of the magnitude of what was happening. Men were encouraged to confront their anxiety directly, to offer their terror to Taweret as a kind of sacrifice that would strengthen her ability to protect mother and child. This led to rituals where expectant fathers would deliberately expose themselves to their worst fears about childbirth, visualizing all the things that could go wrong while priests chanted prayers to Taweret. The men would work themselves into states of genuine panic, then offer that panic to the goddess, believing that by feeding her their terror, they were providing her with the energy she needed to prevent those feared outcomes from actually occurring. The ancient Egyptians also created gods whose existence challenged the very concept of individual identity. Kurti was a ram-headed deity who was said to exist as a collective consciousness distributed across all the rams in Egypt. He wasn't a single being who happened to be associated with rams. He was literally every ram that had ever lived or ever would live, experiencing all of their lives simultaneously. This meant that sacrificing a ram to Kurti was simultaneously an offering to the god and an act of divine self-destruction, since the ram being killed was itself part of Kurti's distributed being. The theological implications were staggering. How do you worship a god by killing parts of him? How do you make offerings to a deity who experiences both the giving and receiving of every gift? The priests of Kurti developed elaborate philosophical frameworks to navigate these paradoxes. They argued that Kurti's distributed consciousness meant he could experience sacrifice as both victim and recipient, that the pain of death was balanced by the joy of receiving worship, that the god's suffering was simultaneously his pleasure. They created rituals that acknowledged this complexity, offering apologies to Kurti for the pain they were about to inflict while thanking him for accepting their sacrifice. But the most unsettling aspect of Kurti's worship was the belief that humans could temporarily join his collective consciousness by eating the flesh of sacrificed rams. Devotees would consume specially prepared ram meat while in deep trance states, claiming that they could experience the god's distributed awareness, feeling the lives of every ram in Egypt flowing through their consciousness. Those who underwent this experience reported sensations that were both ecstatic and terrifying. They would speak of feeling their individual identity dissolving, of becoming aware of thousands of ram lives happening simultaneously, of experiencing birth and death and everything in between from multiple perspectives at once. Some never fully recovered their sense of individual selfhood, remaining partially merged with Kurti's consciousness for the rest of their lives. The god who perhaps pushed the boundaries of identity dissolution even further was Hu, the personification of divine utterance, who existed not as an individual being but as the space between words. Hu was the pause that gives meaning to speech, the silence that allows sound to exist, the gap that separates one thought from another. Worshipping Hu meant paying attention to what wasn't there rather than what was. His priests developed meditation techniques based on listening to silence, training their minds to perceive the spaces between sounds as clearly as they perceived the sounds themselves. They would spend hours in chambers designed to be acoustically perfect, learning to hear the subtle differences between various kinds of quiet. They claimed they could distinguish between the silence that follows speech and the silence that precedes it, between the quiet of empty rooms and the quiet of rooms where someone is thinking. the most advanced practitioners of whose worship could supposedly communicate through shared silence, holding conversations without words by modulating the quality of quiet between them. They would sit together in meditation, exchanging thoughts through subtle alterations in the texture of the silence they shared. To outsiders, these sessions looked like groups of people sitting quietly together. But participants claimed they were engaged in the most profound conversations of their lives, whose temples were architectural impossibilities, designed to embody silence while still functioning as public spaces. They featured chambers with walls that absorbed sound so completely that visitors could hear their own heartbeats, and breathing with startling clarity. Other rooms were designed to amplify the tiniest sounds, making whispers thunder and footsteps boom, forcing visitors to confront the difference between silence and mere quiet. The worship of who attracted people who had become overwhelmed by the noise of ordinary life, those who felt that constant speech and sound were drowning out something essential in their experience. They would come to his temples seeking not just quiet, but a deeper understanding of how meaning emerges from the spaces between words, how consciousness itself might be more about the gaps between thoughts than the thoughts themselves. But perhaps no Egyptian deity embodies the religion's willingness to embrace impossible concepts quite like Khnum, the personification of the primordial waters that existed before creation. Khnum wasn't just the water from which everything emerged. He was the concept of infinite potential, the state of being everything and nothing simultaneously that preceded the moment when things began to exist as distinct entities. The theological challenge of Khnum was that he necessarily existed both before and during creation, containing all possibilities while also being empty of any actualized reality. He was simultaneously the source of everything and the absence from which everything emerged, the fullness that was empty and the emptiness that was full. Worshipping Khnum required a kind of mental gymnastics that pushed consciousness to its breaking point. His priests would attempt to experience the state of infinite potential directly, trying to hold all possible thoughts simultaneously while thinking nothing at all. They would meditate on water until they could no longer distinguish between the water they were observing and the consciousness that was observing it, seeking to replicate the undifferentiated state that existed before creation began. These practices often led to a form of mystical experience that the priests called returning to the source, in which individual consciousness would temporarily dissolve back into the primordial state of infinite potential. Practitioners would report experiencing themselves as vast, undifferentiated awareness containing all possibilities, feeling simultaneously like everything that had ever existed and nothing that had ever been actualized. The danger of these practices was that some priests would become so enamored with the primordial state that they would lose the ability to return to individual consciousness. They would remain in a condition of mystical dissolution, aware but unable to focus that awareness into coherent thought or action. These individuals were cared for by the temple community, who saw them not as casualties but as living reminders of the state from which all existence emerged. As our journey through these impossible deities continues, What becomes increasingly apparent is that the ancient Egyptians had developed a religious system that was far more psychologically sophisticated than we typically give them credit for. They weren't just worshipping idealized human figures writ large. They were grappling with fundamental questions about consciousness, identity, reality, and the nature of existence itself. Their gods embodied paradoxes that modern minds still struggle to comprehend, representing aspects of experience that can only be approached through contradiction and impossibility. In creating these bizarre deities, the Egyptians were acknowledging something profound about the nature of consciousness and reality. That the deeper you probe into the fundamental nature of things, the stranger and more paradoxical they become. And so we reach the end of our journey through the stranger corners of the Egyptian pantheon, having encountered gods who challenge every assumption we might have about what divine beings should be or do. We've met deities who exist in multiple times simultaneously, who feed on the eyes of the dead, who create reality through impossible speech, and who embody paradoxes that would make philosophers weep. What emerges from this bewildering collection is not just a catalog of ancient weirdness, but a profound insight into how the human mind grapples with the fundamental strangeness of existence itself. The ancient Egyptians, in creating these impossible gods, were doing something far more sophisticated than simply inventing colorful stories. They were mapping the outer territories of consciousness, exploring what happens when thought pushes against the boundaries of logic and sanity. Their gods weren't designed to provide comfort or simple answers. They were accurate reflections of a universe that is far stranger than our everyday experience suggests. Deities that embodied the genuine weirdness of being conscious in a reality that often seems to operate according to rules that make no sense whatsoever. Perhaps that's why these ancient Egyptian gods continue to fascinate us today. In our own age of quantum mechanics and consciousness studies of artificial intelligence and virtual reality, we're beginning to rediscover what the Egyptians always knew, that the deeper you look into the nature of reality, the more impossible it becomes. Their bizarre pantheon serves as a reminder that the universe has always been stranger than we allow ourselves to admit, and that sometimes the most honest response to that strangeness is not explanation, but worship of the inexplicable itself. Sleep well, wherever you are in the world tonight, and remember that somewhere in the spaces between dreams and waking, these impossible gods continue their eternal, incomprehensible work, weaving reality from threads of paradox and impossibility, just as they always have.